Welcome to Magdala. Magdala used to be a thriving city, a large city, in the Second Temple period, in the final years of the Second Temple period. It is mentioned by Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, in the 1st century AD. It is mentioned in the New Testament. It is probably also mentioned by another name in the Jewish Talmud, the Jewish sources after the destruction of the temple. It is named the Tower of Nunia, Migdal Nunia in Hebrew. Migdal in Hebrew means a tower. Nunia refers to fish, so the Tower of Fish. It is also known as Taricheia. Taricheia means in Greek the Tower of the Salted Fish. And it is also known as Magdala or Migdal in Hebrew. So the Hebrew name would be Migdal, tower. In Aramaic, it would be Magdala. Remember, people here speak both Aramaic and Hebrew in the Second Temple period, especially by the end of the period. The city of Magdala was a large city surrounded by a wall, which was found by the excavators in this site. Houses were found all around us. It is identified with Magdala because there's no other alternative at this point to the identification. It's not far from Tiberias. It's on the right side of the Kinneret, of the Sea of Galilee, the western side, that is. On the delta of Wadi Hammam, the stream or the river of Hammam, which is right behind us. So it is the correct location. Now, excavations were conducted here already by the Franciscan fathers many, many years ago, decades ago, a bit to the south of our current location. And there they found a large tower. Is this the Tower of Magdala? Sorry to tell you, it isn't. It is from the Byzantine era. Maybe it was erected by the Byzantines as a kind of a creating a touristic site for pilgrims coming and looking for the Tower of Migdal. Maybe that's the case. But in this location, which is another part of the city of Magdala, we have a market with small rectangular ponds identified by the scholars, by the excavators, as fish ponds. So yes, we have some testimony that helps us identify the site as having something to do with fish industry. Now, the question, of course, is it a Jewish site? This is a crucial question, right? Now, obviously, it is a crucial question because in the New Testament, we hear about Magdala. Jesus comes to preach in Magdala. It is sometimes mentioned as Magadan and not necessarily as Magdala, but it is a corruption of the name Magdala. It has to be a Jewish city. How do we know? How can we tell? We had the same problem in other sites, such as Bethsaida. And just like Bethsaida, also here, we have some markers, ethnic markers, helping us identify a site and tell whether it is a Jewish site or not. Where are they, you ask? Right here. That's why I stopped here. Let me take you there. Where am I? Well, it's a rectangular room, and there's a flight of steps descending into a large reservoir. What is this reservoir? What is this site? Well, whoever's versed in the archaeology of the Holy Land, they can identify that immediately. This is a Jewish ritual bath, or a mikveh in Hebrew. What does it mean? A mikveh is a reservoir for water. In Judaism, a Jew is allowed to be unclean, impure, as long as he's not involved in activities that has to do with the holy. For instance, if he goes to the temple in Jerusalem, he has to be clean. He has to purify himself. But on a daily basis, one can be unclean and remain unclean. But what happens if you need to be pure? What do you do? In Jewish houses in the Second Temple period and later, we usually find the facility which helps one become pure. This is the mikveh. One has to go down the steps, dip himself deep in the water, cover everything, including the hair, and when he emerges, he will become clean. Not immediately, by the way. According to Jewish law, he has to wait until sunset. So if you do that immersion early in the morning, you're still not pure until sunset. But at sunset, you are now pure. In an archaeological site containing a mikveh, we know that at least that part of the site is indeed Jewish. Not always, by the way. It doesn't necessarily imply that the entire site is Jewish. For instance, think about Tzipori. Tzipori in the Second Temple period was a Jewish and pagan city. So in the pagan areas, we have Roman temples and shrines. But in the Jewish section, you have houses with mikvaot, with ritual baths. So this is another hallmark of ethnic identification in the Second Temple period from an archaeological point of view. So now that we've established the identity of this site as a Jewish site and as a city, the city of Magdala from the time of Josephus Flavius and the New Testament, we may ask now, is there anything special linked to this city or this site? And the answer, of course, is Mary of Magdala, known as Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, according to the scholars, came from the city of Magdala, came from here. Now, Mary is a unique figure in the New Testament. She is not one of the apostles, but in a sense, she is an apostle. Actually, in Catholic tradition, she's titled Apostola Apostolorum, meaning the apostle to the apostles. Why? Well, it's quite simple. Mary was present during the crucifixion in Jerusalem at Golgotha. And later, she came to the tomb on Sunday. And lo and behold, the tomb was empty. And an angel was sitting there. Angels were sitting there telling her that Jesus has resurrected. She went back and told everyone about the resurrection. So in that sense, she is an apostle. She brings the good tidings, the good word about the resurrection to the other apostles. So this is the city of Mary Magdalene. We have an alleyway, houses with mikvaot, but is there anything unique in what we see around us? Is it a typical Jewish city? Well, yes, it is a typical Jewish city, but these mikvaot, these ritual baths, are quite unique. Ritual baths usually get their water from rain, through probably drainage from the roof. Obviously, you don't have to go to a mikveh. You can go to the sea, you can go to a lake, to a spring to immerse yourself. But it's good when you have one at home. It's more comfortable this way. So it is a typical mikveh in that sense. It has water in it. Now water here comes from the rain. It's been raining for the last couple of hours. But 2,000 years ago, when the level of the Kinneret, the Lake of Galilee, was higher, water came from underground and fed this mikveh. So this is quite unique. I think this is the only example I know of such mikvaot. We have mikvaot that are quite unique. We have an alleyway, we have houses, but on top of all of that, there's something else. A synagogue, one of the most famous synagogues from the Second Temple period, here at Magdala. And I'd like you to come with me and see that. So here we are, facing the most exciting find in the site of Magdala. This is the synagogue of Magdala. This is the entrance. From here, you'd go inside. First, you go past a narrow corridor from left to right. And beyond that corridor, there's another entrance leading you to the main hall. The main hall is rectangular, and perhaps you can already see from here that in the main hall, there's floor. On top of the floor, there's the famous Magdala stone, on which I'm going to discuss or talk shortly. You can also see several pillars. There were many more. They were surrounding the internal courtyard. And to the left and to the right, and even at the wall behind, you can clearly see the remains of a bench for the members of the community to sit around. Now, this is a typical arrangement. This is a typical plan of synagogues from the Second Temple period. We find these synagogues in actually quite many places. One of them was in Jerusalem. There we only have some fragments of architecture and an inscription, which is extremely important. I'll refer to that shortly. Another one at the city of Modi'in. Actually, there's two of them. It's in the Shfela region. Another one in Masada. Another one in Jericho, perhaps. Another one in the palace of King Herod. Another one in Gamla in the north. And there are more. Altogether, we have now about 10 synagogues from the Second Temple period, which is a great surprise, because until recently we thought there were not too many of them, and suddenly we have a number of them. These synagogues are usually arranged as rectangular structures with benches for the members of the community, a central courtyard, sometimes pillars around, sometimes we don't have the pillars. So it seems to fit the general plan of a typical synagogue of the Second Temple period. But there's more to it. Let's go around. I'd like to show you two things and have a closer look at the interior decoration of this structure. Now, here we have a much better look at the interior of the synagogue. We can see the benches here, there, and here. Look at the floor. It is paved with mosaic floors. Here, and to some extent over there too. But in the middle, there's no mosaic floor, which is quite interesting. You'd expect to have the middle section covered with mosaics too. When this mosaic was examined, the archaeologists noticed that under the mosaic, there's a preparatory layer of stones, the same as the one we see now in the middle of the synagogue. The explanation is probably that they started paving the floor with mosaics here, but at one point, after finishing the preparatory layer for the mosaic floor in the center, they ran out of money, or perhaps something else happened, and they never finished the job. But if you look carefully at the pillars, you can see that apart from the mosaics, there was something else. The pillars are actually plastered. They're covered with plaster in different colors. So these are basically frescoes, and such frescoes adorned the pillars and also the walls of the synagogue. It would be a vivid, enchanting view when you got in here in the Second Temple period. Not as dull and gray as it looks today, of course. Now, there are also two interesting stones in here. One of them, of course you can't miss it, is in the middle. I'm going to talk about that shortly. But there's another one, usually missed by visitors. Right in front, that pillar over here you can see a stone which is definitely artificial. It is smooth, it is carved nicely, and there are two grooves, one to the right and one to the left. What is the significance of this stone? Well, some suggest that perhaps what we have there is a table for reading scrolls. Remember, in the Second Temple period, there are no books. The books as we know them today will come much, much later. So what we have here is probably a synagogue with scrolls, with parchments. How does a parchment, how does a scroll look like? Well, it's basically this part rolled like that, this part rolled here, and in the middle, the section that you read. How do you put it on a table? Here, and you read in the middle. So you need something to accommodate the cylindrical portions here and here. That's exactly what we see over there. So it seems like a comfortable solution for positioning a scroll in the synagogue. But wait a second. There's another stone similar to that at the entrance to the synagogue. So there's at least two of them, meaning that they read more than one scroll, and maybe there were more that disappeared. It means that if this is a synagogue, and they read the scrolls, and they learn the Torah, or whatever they do, there must have been a stock of scrolls, tens of them perhaps. So they probably needed a space to store them. It can't be in the synagogue, because you can see every portion here is functional. People sit here and study. There must have been another place to store the scrolls. Maybe this is the explanation for the extension of the synagogue to the south here. Look at this nice portion. There are rooms situated one after the other on that side. It's definitely not part of the synagogue. The synagogue ends here. What are these rooms? What is their purpose? We don't know, but we may assume, we may suggest, perhaps this is the storage area where the scrolls were kept. So everything is nicely explained, except for the main stone. There's two of them. One over there in the synagogue, another one in a display case at the entrance. Do not worry, none of them is the original. They're both replicas. So let's take a look at the replica, which is stored over there in the box. So this is the beautiful replica of the stone found over there, inside the synagogue, exactly where I showed you. What do we see here? Well, it's rectangular, it is carved nicely, and it isn't even. It's not straight. Why isn't it straight? Well, look for yourself and you will see that it stands on four legs. And they're not even. So basically what happens is that the top is slanting a little. So this is the top of the stone, and we can see that it's slanted a bit, and there's no grooves to hold the extremities of the scroll. So what holds it? Look carefully at the top, and right here you can see that there's a little protrusion here, here, and also here and here in the extremities. What are these protrusions? Well, perhaps they were formed, they were shaped like horns, just like a horned altar. Remember, in the First Temple period, there were altars. We find them in archaeology. We hear about them in the scriptures. And these altars had four horns. It's a typical shape of an altar. Now, this is not the temple, but remember, it's a synagogue. People come here to study the Torah. It is associated to the temple, to Jerusalem, to the essence of being a Jew in the Second Temple period. So maybe, out of appreciation and affection to the temple in Jerusalem, they shaped the stone with four horns. And in addition, it had, of course, an advantage. Once you have a slanting, sloping platform and you put a scroll, it will simply slide down. So these help to hold the scroll. On the top, we have a beautiful image of a flower with leaves and two adjacent structures or objects that are quite controversial, but they look to some like palm trees. Why would you find a palm tree? Remember, the temple is in Judea. We have good reasons to believe that one of the symbols of Judea, of the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem, was the palm tree. For instance, think about what happens when the Romans conquered Judea and destroyed the temple a couple of years after the synagogue was constructed in the year 70 AD. The victorious Romans mint coins to celebrate their victory. What do you see on these coins? A Roman soldier standing, a weeping woman, that's Judea, crying, and a palm tree in between. So what we see here may perhaps be linked to the idea of Judea, Jerusalem, and the temple. To strengthen that idea, we must now look down here. And what we see on that side of the stone is a beautiful depiction of the temple menorah. It has 7 branches, the main branch, the basis, and it probably stands on something, a kind of a box or a podium. Now, this is a definite depiction of the temple's menorah during the time when the menorah and the temple are still standing in Jerusalem. So that's quite amazing. Actually, this is one of the earliest ever depictions of the menorah in Jewish history. Quite amazing. Much earlier than, for instance, the depiction of the menorah in Titus's arch, which is about 10 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. So this is quite amazing. Now, to the left and to the right of the menorah, you see 2 jars. What are these? Perhaps they contain oil. It goes well with the menorah because you light the menorah with oil. So it all makes sense. The only problem we have here, perhaps, is what's on the sides. So here, for instance, what we see is a series of arches. What are these arches? Well, no one really knows, but if we take into consideration the fact that the other images here may perhaps be linked to the idea of the temple, we should ask ourselves, what was on the temple that may have looked like that? Well, Josephus Flavius tells us that on the Temple Mount, around the walls, there were porticos. These are basically vaulted areas giving protection from rain and sun. One of them was the royal portico, or the Stoa Basilica, where the money changers probably stood and changed money for Jews coming to the temple. These are perhaps the money changers whose tables were toppled over by Jesus, according to the New Testament. So maybe these arches are a hint to the arches of the portico on the Temple Mount. And next to them, a tiny little thing, right over here, you can see something very odd. No one knows what it is, but when you look at it, it may look just like a Herodian-style lamp. Could be. Altogether, what we have here is a magnificent find. A stone coming from a Jewish synagogue from the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene in the 1st century AD. What is the direction of this synagogue? Which direction did they pray? you'd probably want to ask yourself. Well, if you look straight ahead, you're looking due east. Behind you, it's west. So basically, the main axis here is east-west. The synagogue seems to face maybe east, maybe west. So which direction were they praying? It's a tricky question. The right answer is probably no direction at all, because synagogues in the Second Temple period were different than synagogues in later periods. Remember the synagogue at Capernaum? Its opening, its entrance, faced Jerusalem, faced south. Makes sense. So when people prayed there, they probably turned back into the entrance and prayed towards Jerusalem. But in the Second Temple period, we have good reasons to believe people did not go to the synagogue in order to pray. What did they do in the synagogue? A synagogue, as it is hinted by its name in Greek, synagogein, gathering together, sitting together, is a place for gathering for the community. Remember the synagogue in Jerusalem from the Second Temple period, the one that's been destroyed, but we have an inscription coming from it? You can still go to the Israel Museum and see the inscription for yourself. It's in Greek, but it's legible easily. It says that the synagogue was built by Theodotos, son of Vetanos, a son of Archisynagogos. Archisynagogos in Greek means head of a synagogue. A grandson of an Archisynagogos. And that the synagogue was built for what purpose? It was built, according to the inscription, for studying the laws of Moses and reading the Torah. Not a word about prayers. So Jews did not pray in synagogues in the Second Temple period, and therefore the direction is totally irrelevant. Unlike the period after the destruction of the temple, when synagogues began to be also a place of gathering for prayer. And then we hear about sages asking the question, to which direction should one pray? Some of them say towards Jerusalem. Others suggest to the west, just like in the temple. Remember, the temple is orientated from east to west. Makes sense. Others claim it doesn't matter which direction. So these debates show that after the destruction of the temple, indeed Jews began to pray inside these structures, inside these synagogues, but not before the destruction of the temple. This is truly a magnificent discovery from a Christian perspective. A synagogue from the time of Mary Magdalene, from the time of Jesus near the Sea of Galilee. And maybe one of the visitors to this synagogue was Jesus himself. How do I know that? Let's get back to the Gospels. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, and in verse 23, it says, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. Every synagogue? Here's one of them. So perhaps, indeed, one of the visitors to this place was Jesus himself. Let us go now and continue our journey in the footsteps of Jesus in the Galilee.